Thank you for the introduction, Richard. You said a lot about me already, so I don't need a real introduction anymore. AI no longer has a plug. You can find it online. It's for free. So the PDF is available for you to read. And today I would like to give somewhat of a summary about the content. So if you're looking for more information about this, then you can find the PDF online. Well, today I want to talk to you about ethics by design, especially in relation to AI, obviously. And you could say, well, or you could question why ethics in AI is so important or is such a big topic at the moment, because, well, ethics isn't quite new, right? I mean, ethics has been around for ages, for centuries, actually, and philosophers have been talking about different ethical topics for a long time. And also technology isn't the first time we're talking about ethical topics within, for example, medical biology, cloning, etc. So ethical discussions are around for quite a while, but still, when you look at the discussion surrounding AI, it seems like everything is kind of new and we're just exploring new ground. So I think it's mostly because when we talk about AI, we're not just talking about the technology. We're not just talking about machine learning, deep learning, algorithms, etc. AI is, like this quote is saying from the AI Now Institute, it's about power. So there's a lot of money involved. The stakes are high. A lot of companies are investing big time in this technology. So whoever gets the lead in AI has a big market, obviously. But it's also about politics. It's about geopolitics. I thought it was Putin who said in 2017, whoever will lead AI will be the world leader. So depending on your perception, if it's true or not, still, when people talk about a new technology like this, it's a big impact, right? We're talking about Europe as more or less an ethical center between the United States and China. What is the role of Europe? Are we getting behind or not? Well, etc. And obviously it's also about culture. So it impacts the way we behave, not only the way we communicate, but it also impacts the values we have, the norms we have, and it's actually changing how we look at things around us. And AI is happening now. So normally ethics is about philosophy. It's about philosophy in practice, but more and more with AI, it's getting into practice as we speak, because, for example, we are using Corona tracking apps that are influencing our privacy as we speak. People are getting killed by accidents with self-driving cars as we speak. And more examples are starting to show up that it's not just philosophy like what if, but it's happening right now. So also minorities are being disadvantaged by fraud detection systems. We had a case in the Netherlands where a fraud detection system and it was ruled by law that it was hurting our privacy, and maybe more important, setting back minorities and disadvantaging them and creating what you could call a negative feedback loop. So people with less resources are targeted. And you could say, well, luckily there are a lot of ethical guidelines at the moment, and in truth, there are lots of them. But when you take a look at this world map, you could see that the deliberation or the distribution of these different guidelines is not spread equally. So you could see in the map that most of the ethical guidelines that are being published at the moment are centralized in Europe, America, and Japan. So you could say that in the most cases, it are the more richer countries that dominate the debate about ethics in AI. And as it turns out, it's more or less of a perspective that matters, of course. And it's mostly a European perspective at the moment because, well, the highest density in ethical guidelines is in Great Britain. So as you can see, it's ETH in Zurich. They researched or analyzed 84 different guidelines. And of the 84 guidelines they researched or they analyzed, 13 of them came from Great Britain. So there's quite a lot talk about ethics, But at the same time, and I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing, it's a good first step. I mean, in Europe, we have the ethical guideline for trustworthy AI presented by the high-level expert group from the European Commission, which is a really important first step. But today I'm trying to talk about how it impacts practice and how we can translate these different guidelines into practice. Because when you take a more zoomed in look at those different guidelines, you can say there's a convergence surrounding different topics. So for example, transparency and fairness and privacy, those different principles or values are being used in most of the documents they analyze. And like I said, it's a good thing, but at the same time, it's a what they call it a feel-good principle. So everyone obviously is in favor of a transparent system, and we all want to be treated fairly, and we all want our privacy to be safeguarded. But when we take a look at how we can translate them into practice, there are some challenges. So first of all, we have trade-offs. So you have value conflicts. So there are technical trade-offs. So for example, if we want accurate systems and we want explainable systems, there are some conflicts over there, because the more accurate the system gets, the less explainable it gets, especially when we look at deep learning and algorithms and neural networks. The more complex they get, the more accurate they get, but at the same time, the explainability is difficult. But besides technical trade-offs, there are also social trade-offs. So what we think is important depends on the context. So for example, when we talk about privacy, it's not a generic thing. It depends on the context and the domain in which we are implying it. So simple example maybe, but when I go to the doctor and for an appointment and he or she asks me to undress, that is fair enough, right? I mean, it's a doctor's appointment. But if the baker asks me to do the same thing, it's kind of invasive of my privacy. So as you can see with a simple example like the doctor versus the baker, you see that privacy is a completely different thing in a different context. And those different principles and guidelines that are being written at the moment don't really take the different contexts into account. But it's also about measurability. So for example, if we take a look at fairness, in a lot of documents, fairness is being used, and it's very important, of course. But what is fairness exactly? I mean, we're talking about fairness for hundreds of years, but I don't think we really know how a society without unfairness is looking like. So if you translate it to equality or justice, how does an equal society look like? It's pretty difficult actually to think about a 100% equal society. And with AI, we have another challenge, because we have to think about abstract things like fairness in a more mathematical way. So it's all about statistics in the end. So even though we can agree maybe on what we think is fair and is not fair, we also have to think about how can we make that quantifiable. So you could say 80% transparency. What is 80% transparent? I mean, it's a bit too easy to put it like that, but we have to take numbers into account when we talk about these different general principles. And when we look at, for example, the high-level expert group, they have 7 key requirements, which are all important, but not just evenly quantifiable. So for example, when we take a look at accuracy or something, you can quantify that. But social well-being, it's kind of difficult. And I quote, it's about the interrelationship of the 7 requirements, all are of equal importance. So it's suggesting that every application, every machine learning application should honor all the values and principles at the same time in every context. And I think in practice that is pretty difficult. So like I said, there are different trade-offs, and if you don't think about them in terms of trade-offs, it's pretty difficult to make it happen and to make sure that all those different requirements are in the system. And even if we can make that happen, even if we can make it quantifiable and we can translate it into the context, the question still arises, how can we integrate them into the system? Because we have ethical guidelines on one side, but on the other side, we have the we have practical challenges. So you could wonder if those different guidelines, the different ethical guidelines, actually change the way companies are operating. So some people are saying that ethical guidelines, however important they are more or less a substitute for regulation. So a lot of companies set up advisory boards and ethical guidelines, etc., and try to avoid regulation in a way, because in the end, those advisory boards don't have real power, not like regulations or legislations have. So the question is, are these ethical boards and regulations actually changing the way we operate, yes or no? And more researchers, especially within the value-sensitive design area, are talking about, no, ethics has to be part of the design of technology. So we can't just formulate ethical guidelines and say, okay, here are a set of guidelines. I just hand it over to the programmer, to the developer, and they just, I take my hands off. But the problem is there's too much room for interpretation. So we have to think about how can we teach ethical systems, or how can we teach AI systems to actually act ethically responsible. And that's why I want to talk about 3 different system approaches. So when we look at ethical design or ethics by design, the question is, how can we integrate abstract values into the system? And there are different system approaches. And in the ethical discussions, well, at least that's my opinion, in most of the times, those different system approaches aren't taken into account enough. So the first approach is called static learning, not statistic, but static learning. And it is the approach of this static approach is, can we program rules into the system? So for example, when you look at a self-driving car, you could say, okay, we can calculate every situation and all the rules, all the traffic rules, every situation, we can just program it into the system. The positive side of this approach is we can, before we implement it into the system, we can discuss about it, we can elaborate about it, we can make it a democratic decision, what is and isn't important, and we can make all the rules before we are going to use it. So human control in this approach, well, it's doable because we decide what is important and we implement it in the system. But the downside is, as I mentioned before, you also have to take the exceptions into account. So if you want to program it into the system upfront, you also have to think about all the exceptions that can happen in practice. And I think that there are too many. So if you want, in this slide, you can see an example. You can tell a security robot not to hurt people, but that will be a limitation when that robot has to prevent a terroristic attack. And the same goes with self-driving car. If we want to avoid a collision and run a red light, we will run the red light because otherwise, that's it. So the second approach is more of an adaptive methodology. So instead of programming rules in advance, this approach suggests to learn in practice. So a system could actually learn in practice from its surroundings. So it's given what they call a goal function. So using this goal function, you can specify what is and isn't important, and the system can learn in practice from its surrounding what is and is not ethically acceptable. And Stuart Russell is a big or is a well-known scientist, which think this approach is very promising. The downside, however, is how can it learn in practice what is right and wrong? Because, for example, if someone steals a bread, I don't know, because they have to feed their family, what does it tell? Is it learning that stealing is bad and we cannot allow it? Or do we say, well, in some cases it is allowed? It's pretty difficult to make a system without truly common sense, make it understandable what to do. So I think also this approach has some downsides. And personally, I believe in the third system approach, and it's more or less called intuitive learning. So it is combining static learning and adaptive learning. So you get the rules and the programmed aspect of the static learning, and you get the adaptive possibilities of that approach. So in the end, you combine rules and adaptation and make a more or less intuitive system. It's also given a goal function, but instead of learning in practice, the system or people give some kind of weight factors on these different goals. So for example, if you drive a car, there are different goals we have to obtain, right? So as a driver, I want to be safe and I want to be efficient because I have to get from A to B. But as a society, we also want safety on the road, and we want it to be good for environment, etc. So with this intuitive approach, we can decide upfront what different goals there are and how they weigh in relation to each other. So like I said before, there are different trade-offs. So with this approach, we can think of different trade-offs that can happen in practice, and we can weigh them in relation to each other. So for example, if we think transparency is really important, but privacy is as well, how can we integrate those two values and maximize them in relation to each other? And I personally believe that we have to think about intuitive approaches, because in the end, if we want AI systems to operate in subjective domains, so not only objective data, where right and wrong is crystal clear, but when it's more or less subjective, what we think is important and is good or bad is more subjective, then the system itself does also have to make different intuitive choices. So Richard told about an ethical design game I created, which was based on or inspired by the Scrum process. Within the Scrum process, they use so-called user stories. And the positive side of user stories is that it integrates different things that are lacking in ethical debates right now. So like I said, most of the times ethical discussions lack of the different context, different stakeholder perspectives, and we have to weigh the different values in relation to each other. And as it happens, a user story has all of these different aspects already in itself. So you can choose a specific domain and think about different stakeholders and how they have different interests given the context. So as you can see, a user story is defined as the stakeholder. I want certain values in order to, what are the interests given the context. And the game I created, this is a visual of it. It's only in Dutch at the moment, but we are working on an English version. But already on ethicsinc.nl, you can find some more information. You can also find the paper we wrote about a more agile approach towards ethical development. So that PDF is also available for free over there. And like Richard said in the introduction, the game is used in order to make it more clear that there are different stakeholders involved who have different interests in different contexts. So for example, when we take a look at self-driving car, as a user or as a driver, I have a different specific need when it comes to privacy than when you ask the manufacturer of the car, or when you ask the programmer of a car, or when you ask it to a legislator. We all have different interests. So when you look at the high-level expert group guidelines, you can also see that transparency is not just one abstract definition. There are sub-values within. So the same goes with privacy, etc. And this game helps people to not only look at the different ethical questions from different perspectives, but also weigh the different values in relation to each other. So it's not a holy grail or something, and it's not the answer to our ethical questions and problems that we have, but it can certainly help people to learn from different perspectives and to really think from different perspectives, from different stakeholder perspectives. So in the end, it's really important to talk about ethics, and we need to keep talking about what we think is important. But my suggestion would be that we not only talk about what we think is important, but also how we think different values relate to each other. So we have to really give weight factors towards those different values and actually translate them into quantifiable, measurable goals. And those measurable and quantifiable goals have to be given to the system so it can actually think or intuitively come up with the best reaction that we need. So if we just use AI and machine learning in, for example, image recognition or more or less simpler domains, then it's probably not necessary. But if you are perceiving a more human and emotional artifact, it, in my opinion, I strongly believe that it needs some ethical and intuitive ethical system approach. So if you want to know more about the subject, please take a look at AI No Longer Has a Plug. It has a more in-depth about what I was talking about today. I mean, it's evening over here, so it was a long day. So I think it's in written, it's way better than what I can do today in 15 minutes. But thank you for your attention. Please take a look and let me know what you think about it. You can always send me an email at vanbelkom@stt.nl, but you can also just find me on LinkedIn, Rudy van Belkom, and then we can just connect and talk about the topic